Hey writers, welcome back to the Write in the Head podcast with me, John Paul Sperling. I'm a screenwriter and a life coach. So this podcast is where we bring those two worlds together, talking about the mindset required to turn that passionate pursuit of writing into a thriving career. Coming up on today's episode, we welcome back to the podcast the wonderful Frankie Campisano. Frankie is one of my favorite people. He's a writer, a comedian, a filmmaker. He's worked at NBCUniversal, Sony Pictures, Fox Broadcasting Company. I probably could keep going. Today's subject matter: how to make an exceptional short film. Hello, Frankie Campisano. Welcome back to the Write in the Head podcast. Very, very excited to have you back on the show. Today we are talking all about short films, and I recently received some feedback to say, your podcast is great. Perhaps you could make your questions a bit more pithy. So, Frankie, what are the core tenets of a short film?
That's a great question. Great opening question, John. Glad to be back. I'm going to back it up a little bit and say that it's almost easier to figure out what a short film is not. I think that a lot of folks think a short film somewhere between, could be as short as a minute, could be 30, could be a little bit longer. You start to get into a mini feature, but I think a lot of folks have this proclivity to go, let me tell a 90-minute story in the time allotted, whether that's 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And candidly, that's not the best way to approach it. It can be done. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule. But I actually think of short films as really similar to short stories, in that a short story is not trying to cram a whole novel into a small space. It's its own form with its own kind of rules and rhythms. And so I tell folks that for a short film, whether that is a proof of concept for a larger piece or not, you're really only telling the first step of your character's kind of transformational arc. However long that might take, whatever form that might take. It is the moment that a character realizes they have the capacity to change or they need to change. It's not necessarily that full arc of having gone through the journey and coming out the other side.
Interesting. So it's kind of, if I was to use my BS2 beats, it's kind of the setup, maybe a bit of theme, and up until we might call it the inciting incident, and then maybe a quick moment of sort of realization that something needs to change, but they're not necessarily going into that journey of the actual change taking place.
Exactly. And like I said, there are exceptions to this. Not every short film you can't always retrofit it into that kind of format, but I find that tends to be the most successful, and it gives the creatives a lot of runway, whether they want to take that short and develop it into a feature. And there's two kind of schools of thought there. You could either have it be the opening scene, or it could be, a microcosm of the larger story. If you're going to take it that way, I think that makes it just harder on yourself to try to do that.
Right. Trying to fit in the whole story into just a few minutes, as you said, definitely possible. But at what point does that become limiting? And I think if you're spending a great deal of time trying to cram all of that in, you're probably missing opportunities to just be more artistic, right? Because you're focusing too much on the structure of the whole thing. Exactly.
And then it's also challenging on the other side of it when you're trying to develop a feature where if you feel like you've successfully told all of your beats in, let's say, a 15-minute runtime, now how do you stretch that 6 times over to tell a feature? You either have to just put in a lot of filler and you kind of have a boring movie, or you have told a new story, and at that point the short's not necessarily serving any function.
Yeah, I'm imagining now the meeting where you're trying to arrange financing and you say, well, we need 100,000 to go and make this feature, but you've already told the story in the 15-minute version, so why would we give you money? That's it's quite a funny image when you just like that facepalm moment, like, guys, why did we tell the whole story in the short? Should have held something back. Where do you think, where have you seen, maybe is the better question, writers and filmmakers are perhaps going a bit wrong with their short films? So in other words, what would make a bad short film? Given that all of this is purely perspectival, it's just our opinions, what would you say makes a bad short film?
So for me, the the kind of dichotomy that I'm always analyzing every short film through, whether that's my work I'm seeing at a festival, work that friends are sharing with me for feedback. There's kind of two potential questions that could be in the audience's mind. And that's either what's going to happen next, which is what you want them to be thinking. That means they're following the story, they're invested in the characters, the gears are turning to see if they can get to where you're going before you're going to go there. The way that you do when you're watching a movie and you anticipate the twist and you're thrilled about it, because that means you and the writer are having a conversation. What's going to happen next is where you want your audience. Where you often end up with short films and from emerging filmmakers especially is what's going on, where you don't have that footing. You are not invested in the characters because maybe you don't know which characters to invest in. You're not invested in the plot machinations because you haven't properly established kind of your baseline reality. So when there's these new story elements or subversions coming in, there's no novelty because the audience doesn't know what's different. Another way to look at it, you need to really firmly establish your once upon a time before you can then do and then one day. A lot of short films, maybe out of fear of that limited runtime, try to jump right to the and then one day.
Right.
And try to get to the new thing.
Going straight to the inciting incident, again, just to use terminology that I'm more familiar with because I'm a structure freak.
Exactly.
Yeah, I can see that. I've seen a few short films that do that. It's straight into this world of chaos, and I don't know that this is any different to usual because we haven't established the ordinary world before things change.
100%. And sometimes that's as simple as a beat. Letting us spend a little bit of time with that protagonist before they're thrown into the situation that maybe 90% of the runtime of your short is going to be engaging with. Just having that little baseline of reality so that we have that kind of shared footing before things start to change. Very often in short films, I find myself maybe 1 or 2 minutes in and we're already either subverting the baseline reality or it's a pile-on and it's going very quickly. And again, you're already going, wait, what's going on? Who am I supposed to care about? Who are these characters? Why is this happening to them? And you don't know yet even, it's very easy to then lose where you are in the short film. I think if you're distributing your plot beats correctly and you're spending the time where you need to, the audience should be able to intuit, okay, we're approaching the midpoint or we're winding down or, regardless of the runtime, they should still be able to feel out where they are in the story. And I've definitely watched short films where I'm 15 minutes in and I am not sure if this really feels like it's going to go for 5 more minutes or like it needs to go for another 30 or more. And I think that is because those early beats just have you on the back foot and then you're playing catch up the rest of the time.
Definitely. I've had that same feeling. Yeah, I heard it said once, and I forget who said this, I apologize, but going back to kind of just establishing the theme or the ordinary world, you can do that in 15 seconds, and the way the guy laid it out was 5 seconds at home, 5 seconds at work, 5 seconds at play. You pretty much know who this person is in 15 seconds. And then, depending on what your nature of your film is, obviously any one of those 3 areas could then be disrupted. And you've now got the adventure. I love the way that he phrased it. I thought, yeah, what else do we need to know about this person? Who they are at home, who they are at work, who they are at play. That kind of tells you so much about the person, about the protagonist. And then you've got some areas that you can play with. I want to ask, so you mentioned there identifying who we're supposed to root for, relate to, defining the protagonist. What, in your experience, what have you done to kind of make sure that that is happening? Is there some actual steps that you take to make sure we know who this is? Does it depend entirely on the story you're telling? How does that go for you? We will get back to the chat in just a moment. Firstly, if you're enjoying today's episode, please do go ahead and subscribe to the channel. That's a great zero-cost way of supporting the Right in the Head mission. It takes you about 2 seconds to click that button. If you want to go the extra mile, write us a comment as well. That will tickle the fancy of the YouTube algorithm, meaning this content shows up for more screenwriters just like me and you. Thank you so much. Back to the chat.
So one school of thought that I have recently heard and I think is probably going to be my go-to moving forward, is the idea of this private moment with your protagonist. Just like you said, this could be a 5-second beat, it could be a 15-second beat. It's fairly minimalist, but it's a load-bearing beat because you're spending time with this character before the conflict, before the story. Just the fact that the film is spending any time to establish this character kind of in isolation. Maybe that's their home life, maybe that's their work life, whatever context that we see them in first. That tells us, hey, this real estate on the page or on the screen is being dedicated to this character with a function. And sometimes that's just as simple as getting used to seeing that face, knowing, okay, here's this character, they're in this situation, this is kind of their emotional state. And you can kind of plug and play any detail in there, because then you're going to get to your inciting incident, you're going to get to the story, and we're going to start building. But that, again, it comes back to that once upon a time part. You got to tell us who this person is as quickly as possible, but also as definitively as possible, because we're probably going to jump right into that subversion and the story starting. And so we need a very quick sense of who this protagonist is to then know how are they going to react in this situation, or, what internal conflict are they working against? And there's a lot of ways to telegraph that pretty quickly. But when we jump right into the protagonist dealing with a direct conflict or a situation or whatever, we're now seeing them in the context of the plot rather than the context of their character. And so it's, again, you don't want the audience having to play catch up.
Yeah. Do you subscribe to the save the cat moment where we all fall in love with the protagonist early on? Have you used that?
It's not a beat that I dislike. I find that the kind of like private moment opens up the aperture of what that could be. It doesn't have to be this. Because I think with Save the Cat, we often look to that kind of another way I've heard it is like Pet the Dog, where you're really trying to lay it on thick of like what a good guy my protagonist is. Whereas like the private moment opens it up like it might not be that your protagonist is such a good guy. They might be a jerk. The story might be them, learning a valuable lesson or being confronted with the reality of their behavior. That private moment where we see them. And truly, it is a private moment. They are the only character in the scene. If you can do it efficiently, tells us something about them in a different context that then will inform what we're going to see. And once you start to look for this, you can see it in shorts, you can see it in features. A really great one that I like is Birdman, where you actually have a private moment with Michael Keaton's character right at the beginning, where he's meditating and having a kind of conversation with himself, but his alter ego. And already you're getting to set him up for the problem that this character's facing. You kind of get where he's at. You have a little bit of enticing the audience to stay invested because you show them something surprising when he is levitating off the floor. But then the movie kind of really starts in the scene after that. You could cut that scene and you wouldn't have missed much, but you're going to be reaching and looking for that reason of like, well, why do I care about this guy? And that one beat where you spend a little bit of time with him before everything else kicks off gives you that through line.
Yeah. I think we mentioned last time that we spoke on the podcast about the book Kill the Dog. And I've mentioned it a couple of other times since then because it's such a radical departure from Save the Cat, as the title would suggest. But it's another way of building empathy for your protagonist. You don't have to see them do something nice. You could see the world being really nasty to them. And even though they're not reacting well, they're reacting poorly, they're making bad choices, you still empathize because what else are they supposed to do in this situation? I like to think of it in that way now, because before I think I was focusing quite hard on how do I make people like this character? And then you realize, actually, I like a lot of people in real life that are not always making great choices, but they have redeeming features in other ways. Or they're just funny. I don't know that there's a true Save the Cat moment in Groundhog Day. The guy's a jerk right off the bat,
yeah,
but in a funny way. And so it's kind of easy to get on his side. Anyway, let's not get distracted by Groundhog Day, because that would be a whole different episode. I could talk about that movie for hours. How do you, going back to what you said about making your audience wonder what's coming next versus asking what's going on, do you have something in place as you're writing, or maybe it comes in as you're shooting. How do you bear that in mind, and what are you doing to steer it towards keep them guessing but don't confuse them?
Well, it's less about keeping them guessing so much as keeping them invested. And another way to look at it is that drama, screenwriting in general, is the selective delivery of information. And so choosing what information you're giving in what order, naturally you want to be building the audience's interest. And so for me, I like to start with a striking image. I think especially in short films, your opening and ending images do a lot of heavy lifting. If you can in some way surprise the audience with that first image, like an example that I go to for this is there's a short film from about 10 years ago called Mr. Happy. Vice put it out. Chance the Rapper starred in it at a time when he was kind of big. Essentially, it is about a guy who is at the end of his rope. He decides that he is ready to check out. He hires a hitman online, Mr. Happy. It says, once you hire this guy, there's no going back. And he hires him, and then he's kind of just waiting. And so you kind of spend a lot of time with this character as he's reevaluating his life, knowing that the inevitable is coming. And that creates a tension that carries you through a lot of quiet moments. But the first image of this film, you start with fireworks, which is, fun, creates, there's an emotional association that everyone kind of naturally has with fireworks. But then they pull back and they show that we're not watching fireworks, in person. The protagonist is watching fireworks on a small computer screen alone in his bedroom with just the glow of the monitor. So you've set up an image to open the film, fireworks. Now you've pulled back to say, hey, it's not exactly what you thought. Now you've set up your private moment with the protagonist. He's alone in his room. It's just by virtue of the framing and the setting, it's isolating, and you start to build empathy for this character who's clearly desperate for connection and can't find it in his life. And then the story starts to get going. And so you've already shown us one thing, you've surprised us, you've then painted the scene a little bit more. And at that point, we kind of know this character. We have a sense of where his story's taking him, and we're invested. We want to find out, one, is the hitman that he hired going to come through and take him out? And two, is he inevitably going to hit that point where he regrets it? It's kind of table stakes. You go into the film thinking, well, of course, there's got to be a story here. There's got to be drama. If he's starting on page one saying he wants this hitman to come and take him out, by the end of the story, of course, he's going to have gone through a journey and come out the other side. But because this is a short, you're not going to spend, that could be page 20 of a feature where he realizes his mistake and now he's got to unwind this problem for the rest of the movie. But it's a short. And so there isn't that runtime. All these pieces are going to hit ahead in I think about 15 minutes. And so you have all the ingredients laid out right there in the beginning, and then it's just letting it go. And you've gotten the audience on board. They kind of know what's going on. They know just enough about this character, just enough about this conflict, that now they want to see what's going to happen next. Not, why is this guy doing this? What website is he what is any of this? All of that is kind of not spoon-fed to the audience, but delivered in a way where every time that you get the answer to one question, it's setting up the next narratively. So you're never confused about what you're watching, especially in the beginning.
Yeah, the fireworks example there, that really blew me away. I haven't seen the movie, I haven't heard that before, but the awe and the wonder of fireworks and that big open space and probably a crowd of people, it just brings it all to mind immediately. And then to pull back and see a guy on his own watching on a small screen, I've been that guy, Frankie, and that was to show that duality. That's genius. I love that idea. If it didn't already exist, I would steal it, but you've just heard it here that it does exist. Also, it's kind of funny, Chance the Rapper didn't do as well in the UK, and I think it's because we pronounce it Chance, because Chance sounds so much better.
That's great. That's really
Chance the Rapper sounds a bit posh, doesn't it? It's not quite as cool. I'm really interested in your process, your workflow for short films. It's not something that I have a ton of experience with. I have done it, but it was more, I was more on board as a writer and then an actor. So I felt like there was a whole bunch of stuff that happened in the middle there that I wasn't involved in. Do you think about things like target audience and eventual film festivals, even distribution? Is any of that going on early on, or do you just write what comes from your heart and then figure the rest out as you go along?
In the short film space, I am absolutely thinking about the final product. Especially as someone who has a few short films under my belt, has a roster of collaborators eager to make more stuff. I don't want to put time and effort into developing a project and then drafting it if I don't think I could produce it. Especially in the short film space, the reality is no one is selling a short film script, so it isn't worth anything until you produce it. I think in the short film space, and more so than in features or television, the final product is kind of driving my thought process, especially with regards to the overall tone of the piece, what kind of an audience I think is going to connect with it, where I might try to platform the actual final product. My most recent short film, for instance, is a short called Secret Menu Beauty Pageant, which from the very first moment of ideation, I knew I was trying to make an Adult Swim style infomercial short. And so with that in mind, I knew it wasn't necessarily going to go over with the kind of typical film festival audience. Um, it wasn't going to give folks a lot of what they were looking for in terms of scene work or character work or structure. It's a lot more avant-garde with like one toe in the world of sketch. It's a very dry sense of humor, but I knew that there's a specific audience for that. And with that in mind, that kind of drove a lot of the creative decision making. Having that kind of real sense of this is this is the space that this film lives in. And again, going back to the very beginning of our conversation, like knowing what it's not. I knew it wasn't ever going to be, a true horror film, although it flirts with genre conventions. I knew it wasn't ever going to necessarily be an out and out comedy because of the tone and structure and the general vibe of it all. And so finding that sweet spot where audiences were more primed for that kind of experimental thing, and folks would kind of it would resonate with them, but also that it was just being presented in the right context. Even that short, as it plays in festivals, the reaction kind of depends on how it's programmed. When it is slotted between different comedies, people immediately pick up on all the humor and generally the structure of the film is such that it gets funnier as it goes on. By the end, it's almost farcical. It truly is a sketch, but in the beginning, it's playing it pretty close to the chest, and almost pretending to be like a true crime kind of thing. And so sometimes it gets programmed with drama and horror, and I find that when that happens, folks are kind of on the edge of their seat. They're engaged, but they don't know that they have permission to laugh. And so they find themselves confused about halfway through when it starts to get sillier and funnier, and they don't necessarily know what to do with it at that point. But that was all by design. I knew going into it from the very beginning the types of things I was looking to not just emulate, but iterate on. It was very much always going to be, if Adult Swim hired me to make an Adult Swim infomercial, what would I turn in? What would I produce? And so that was kind of my mission statement for that piece. And I'm really proud of what we achieved with it. Other shorts, I have gone at it with a totally different framework, different audience, different tone, different ideal kind of distribution model at the end.
Yeah, I imagine that it's very different project to project, which kind of brings this follow-up question to mind. There's a lot of writers that are perhaps thinking about creating their first short. Is it just for writers who also want to direct, produce, wear many hats? Or in your opinion, do you think every writer should at some point try and go beginning, middle, end, let's create a short film?
I say the latter. I say just try to do it. Just get yourself out there. It's one of those things where I was looking at my portfolio as a screenwriter, and you could have the best 10 scripts you've ever written, but at the end of the day, that is 10 identical stacks of paper as your deliverables. If you have a short, even if it's not your best script and it's not, going to go and win an Academy Award, just by virtue of having a produced short that you can show someone, they're going to engage with it differently. There's, the caveat is every filmmaking process is going to be one of compromise, and what you see in your head when you're writing might not be what you capture on set. It might not be how it translates in the edit, but I also think that's an extremely valuable process to go through as a writer. As much as I like to direct stuff that I've written, I also really like co-writing with someone and then letting them direct it. One, because it takes a little bit of pressure off of me, and two, because then I get a little bit more experienced in seeing how might someone interpret and translate my work. And rather than viewing it as, does this director, I try to approach it from how effectively can I get my ideas down on the page so that any director could come and shoot a version of this, and my initial, thought process and ideas still translates. It might not be my ideal execution, but it should still translate, even if I was totally removed from the process at that point.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can do this on the spot. I apologize for putting you on said spot.
Okay.
If there is a writer listening to this and they think, I've got a short film script, what are the steps they take from where they are right now to, I can't say all the way to completion because there's so many steps, but just to get the ball up and running, just to get things up and running, to get the ball rolling, 3 to 5 action steps that they could maybe dive into after they've finished listening to the podcast episode, of course.
I would say the number one thing, the first thing, is watch a bunch of short films immediately. Take in as many shorts as you can. Look at ones that are placing in festivals. Look at ones that are not. Get a sense of the rhythms. Get a sense of the scope and scale of their productions. Get a sense of how many locations are they using? How many actors are they using? Just to get a sense instinctually of what you might need to do in step 2, which is edit and revise and get a white page version where any idea is a good idea, get it in there, get the draft, to then, okay, now it's time to make this. You have to be conscious of production, costs, how many people are you going to have on set, not just on screen, but on your crew. What locations do you have? Locations that you think might be really easy, but if you're here in Los Angeles, for instance, you might need permits and paperwork and all these hoops to jump through. The flip side of that is once you've kind of taken a lot of the fun out of it probably and kind of like sanding the edges off in revision, look back at it, see if you're still excited about it, that's good. That's a sign that on the script level, something's working. But then take stock of what resources you do have and start to work stuff back in. It's Robert Rodriguez who said, anything you have, like if you have access to a cool thing, write it into your movie. Why not? If you have a friend that has a really cool car, see if you can use it for the film. Even if it's parked in the driveway, it just makes that shot more dynamic and interesting, and it stands out. As many details like that you can work into, especially when it's not going to cost you anything, that's going to elevate every step of the process. It's going to make the world of your film feel more lived in. It's going to make the composition of your shots more interesting and dynamic. And then it's going to make the final product look like it had that much more thought and production value in it.
Yeah. Action steps, just to recap here, definitely take on a whole bunch of, not ideas necessarily, but research, I would call it. Research other short films. Watch as many as you can. Look at the ones that got into festivals versus the ones that didn't. See what you can learn from that. Step 2, go back to the page. See if you can make some refinements using that production eye. So we actually now have to film this. How can we do this? Was there a third step in there? I think it would be... I mean, I don't know if you touched on it, but for me, it would be start building the team that you would need.
Yeah.
Surely that's the next step. What does that look like for you? Obviously, you've known a whole bunch of people for a very long time, so it's maybe you don't have to think too much about this anymore. But if you could cast your mind back to bygone era. What is it like to build a team for a short film? Are there some sort of heuristics you use for that?
Yeah, I think the first and probably the most important one is everyone has to be on the same page for what they're making. You'll often hear it almost like a joke in film criticism for features where it's like, oh, this actor is in a totally different movie than everybody else. And that is going to happen. But on a short film, chances are you don't have so much material or talented actors or resources that you can get away with that. You kind of need everyone to have a cohesive vision and an understanding for what they're trying to make. Sometimes that's as simple as saying, "Hey, here are my comps. I'd love for all the cast and crew to just watch this one movie or these two movies, and get a sense of kind of where you're trying to take the vision." Um, it it can be hard if people are not on the same page, especially the performers. But even just having your different department heads, knowing that everyone's going to be on the same page and is working towards the same aesthetic goals rather than kind of competing. Because when you're on set day of, like, you need to know that you have picked a team that is going to be able to execute your vision and that everyone has the same end goal in mind. And so for me, it's one, making sure everybody who's working on the film wants to make that type of movie. You know, if they want to make something different or they don't necessarily align with your vision, there's going to be other opportunities to work with them. No one's going to take it personally. The flip side of that is, you, I don't necessarily think it is the most beneficial thing for a filmmaker to always work with the exact same roster of people. And so I try to do a little bit of a blend. I will go to a handful of department heads that I have worked with, that I know and can trust, that I know could execute my vision, even if I was not going to be on set, whether that's as a writer or a director. People I would trust to completely hand the film over to. And then I want to work with some new folks. And it's not going to be people who are completely unvetted. You know, it's going to be people who have probably worked with the folks I do know on other productions. But it's just one way to kind of grow your own network, work with more talented folks who are going to have, you know, their own networks. It's kind of like concentric circles of collaboration. But also good ideas can come from anyone. And you sometimes can easily find yourself in a rut working with the same team where you just go, well, this is how we light this type of scene. And so let's do it. Whereas, you know, maybe you have someone who you haven't worked with who's going to come in with a totally different perspective. And maybe that perspective changes the look of a shot, which changes the look of your movie, which then becomes a defining moment for the film. I think you just have to be open to that flexibility. And certainly, like, as the director, your job is to make those decisions. But if you're not putting yourself in a position to hear the best advice from the best people, you might leave stuff on the, you know, you don't want to leave anything on the field once the film is wrapped.
I love that answer. That's a great answer. I'm learning so much from this conversation. I'm feeling inspired to go ahead and make a short film, thanks to you. What would be the purpose of that? So what I'm getting at here is, let's go ahead and motivate some listeners by saying, what is the purpose of making a short film? What can it lead to, either from your direct experience or just from what you've seen other people going through?
I think it depends on kind of, it really does depend on what you want out of the process. And that then it kind of has a snowball effect of what the end goal is will then change the decision making all the way up to when you're sitting there starting to ideate. For me, with using Secret Menu Beauty Pageant as an example again, I wanted a creative sample for my voice as a writer-director. And so I knew that there were going to be certain things I was going to put greater emphasis on and certain things that I was not going to be demonstrating with this film. I think as a writer, one of my strong suits is dialogue. Strictly speaking, there's no dialogue in Secret Menu. It's all voiceover narration. So there's the element of it. You can see my voice as a writer and you can see the decision making that I'm making. But if you're looking to see how do I handle two characters in conflict in a scene together, you're not going to get that in that short. But I knew that from the very beginning. And so all the decision making as it came together stayed on, we stayed the course of this is what we're trying to do, as opposed to a short where you might be looking to demonstrate exactly the opposite. Here is how I direct actors. And you have a short that is two characters in one room in one setting, and it is, a kind of like taut thriller. It's totally different type of directing, totally different type of writing, totally different type of casting and production value. So just kind of knowing what you want to do with the movie, not just kind of what movie you want to make, but why you would show someone this piece. And you can have calling cards for different things, but the reality is these things all take time, and so it's kind of what you're doing with a film, when and why. For example, we have a short that we're going to release in the fall that is far more traditional narrative. It has scene work, it has characters. It is a really polished production. I think you can see a lot of the production value on screen, and that's drastically different than Secret Menu. But because we're releasing this other short first, hopefully our audience understands that some of the aesthetic decisions in Secret Menu are deliberate choices. We're purposefully doing these things. And here is a different piece that shows the contrast so that you trust us when we say it was intentional and not a mistake. Because that's one of the other frameworks that and I'm constantly pushing my team, is every creative decision, we don't want an audience member to read it or interpret it as a mistake.
You've given us so much information here, Frankie. What would be the one takeaway? Let me think how to phrase this question. I've heard this podcast episode. I'm super psyched about making my first short film. Number one lesson that you've learned so far from all of the short films you have made that you would want a newbie short filmmaker to take away from this episode? Can you boil it down into one?
Play to your strengths, but also don't let hurdles keep you from making the film. Let the hurdles be those kinds of creative guidelines. Secret Menu, I first ideated it in my apartment during the pandemic. I was like, how do I make something without a cast, a crew, any equipment? And then it became this voiceover driven kind of dreamlike story, so that when we were on set, we didn't have to record sound. We knew it was going to be voiceover driven. That one decision out of necessity then kind of set the ball rolling for how we were going to do it. And so if you're looking to make your short film and you're like, I don't have any actors, great. You're going to have to be in it. Work with what you have, and know that if you put everything out there, you make a short film that you think is a worthy creative calling card. Great. Next step is to get it out there in front of people. If you make it and you go, well, I learned a lot, but I don't really necessarily want to put this one out, that's okay too. Do it all over again. I have definitely done shorts where I don't want anyone to see them because they're for a million reasons, but because they're not if someone were to watch one thing of mine, that's not what I would lead with. And that also is like the way that I think about it, is if someone's going to watch one short of mine, why would it be this short? And that comes from the very beginning. Why would I make this short if it's going to be the one thing someone would watch of mine?
Great answer. Again, thank you so much for all this information. I'm going to have to watch this episode back and make a few notes for my next short film endeavor when I eventually get around to doing that. I think I've been on the fence about whether to go ahead and invest time, money, energy into doing such a thing. And I think you've sold me on the idea here. This has been a great talk. We've been doing something recently on the podcast where we spend a few minutes at the end of the episode sort of flipping the question asking over to the guest, asking questions that would be perhaps suitable from a life coachy kind of perspective. Every time I've done this so far, I've made the note, we need a name for this section, for this segment of the episode. We still don't have a name yet. It's just me roughly introducing it. Still going to make time to brainstorm that name. You and I spoke about this. I'm just going to be real. We spoke about it about an hour before we jumped on this call today. So we very quickly came up with the question along the lines of, how do we balance creative inputs with creative outputs? You worded it a lot more poetically than that. It was something along the lines of, how do we balance what we're taking in while we're in the creative phase? And I think you gave the example of, certain people don't watch horror movies when they're writing a horror because they don't want to be too heavily impacted. Am I in the right ballpark here?
Yeah.
I don't want to
Yeah,
take your question and turn it into my own question to myself.
no, that's totally it. I think that it is a balancing act, and some folks get really granular with it. Like if a specific show is a comp that they're using, they won't watch it. I've done that myself. And then sometimes it is as broad as an entire genre or an entire medium. Like I know folks who, when they're writing a feature, they won't watch movies, and that's certainly not. I can't go that far with it. But it is I think a difficult balance to strike.
It is difficult. It is very difficult, and it's something that I'm working on constantly. It's interesting. What came to mind here when you first mentioned this? It wasn't an example from screenwriting, and I hesitated to bring that into the conversation. But I figure, if this is where my gut took me, let's talk about that. So it was an example from when I was spending quite a lot of time producing music. And when you produce music, you've got your DAW set up, you've got however many tracks that you're working on. And a lot of people tell you the first track in your project window should be a reference track. So as you're mixing your own music, you can toggle back and forth between this professionally made and mastered track so you can hear how it's roughly supposed to sound. And it makes so much sense, because when you first start making music, if you make it in a vacuum, you can think it sounds great in your own headphones, even on your own speakers, and then you play something that is, an actual released track, and you're like, oh, okay. I can't actually hear my bass at all, or my snare is just way too loud, depending on, genre. And so I used to use this technique a lot. I would do about 20 to 30 minutes of producing and mixing on my own track, and then just toggle back to the reference track and try and, just kind of judge if it was roughly in alignment. And it does work in terms of making your music sound like it's been made in a professional studio, because you get the levels right. The downside of that is it sounds the same as everything else. And to the point where you're like, oh, that one has a drum fill right before going into the chorus. I don't have that yet. Maybe I need a drum fill right there. You probably didn't, because if your song is just flowing and it sounds great, you don't need to add all the bells and whistles that this other track has. I try and do the same when it comes to screenwriting. So I want to play about 80% of my time in just creativity mode. And I'll come back to sort of how I do that in a minute. And then there's 20%, it's about 80-20, where I'm leaning on what other people have done just to make sure I'm within certain guidelines. I don't want to be copying. I want to come up with something original. But if it's too much outside of what people are expecting, it can really work against you. So I think of it in terms of sort of 3 stages almost. There's this input, synthesis, and output. And it roughly correlates with what happens in our brains when we take on new information. There's encoding, and then there's consolidation. Consolidation is the second stage, and then there would be something that would be called retrieval, synthesis. So we're taking on new information. That's my input stage. And yeah, like about 20% of my time, I'm doing that. Then there's this long stretch of time that I would call synthesis. Oftentimes that looks like going for a walk, or just staring at a wall, or meditating, or whatever I can do to allow things to kind of percolate. And then there's output, which is where I spend most of my time, because I honestly do believe that I don't think our progress and our success is as heavily connected to inputs as it is to outputs. If you are
Agreed.
consistent with your output, you will make progress, you will get more feedback, you will improve at a faster rate. And that's actually been difficult for me in certain ways, because I love taking on new information. I realized at one point, it was only a couple of months ago, I was spending so much time every day listening to podcasts. I would wake up, put on a podcast while I'm making breakfast and doing stretching and, preparing for the day. Every meal break I had, I was taking on information with podcasts. And I'm, shooting myself in the foot. Anybody listening to this? Podcasts are great. You should keep listening. But at a certain point, I realized I'm still doing my writing every day, but I'm not giving my mind any time to just be quiet and just process. It's all incoming. So I stopped doing it. And for a few days, I didn't listen to a podcast. And I felt actually like a fear of missing out. I was not listening to episodes that I would normally listen to. I would see them on YouTube, like, I want to listen to this one. But I didn't. And I actually came up with some ideas for current projects that I'm working on. They were obviously already in there. I just hadn't allowed them breathing space. I hadn't allowed them to just bubble up to the surface. And it was quite an amazing experience. And then I downloaded a whole bunch of podcast episodes and just listened to them all in one sitting over the course of a weekend. So that was when I came up with this whole, like, maybe it's about 20% inputs, time to synthesize, and then, in terms of workload, 80% of it has to be output. I'm checking my math. If it's 20% input and 80% output, that leaves no time for synthesis. So rearrange those numbers, do what you want with them. Mm-hmm. But focusing more on output, I think, has been one of the reasons that I've been, any sort of degree of success that I've had in any industry has been just focusing on how much time I'm spending on outputs.
I agree 100%. I think that there are a lot of folks who have a great idea and they will go to bat for that idea. Maybe they will write a draft. Maybe they'll do the deck. They'll do everything they're supposed to do with that idea. And then they will wonder, well, why isn't anything coming of this? And the unfortunate reality, depending on how you look at it, is that ideas are not worth anything. I tell folks, an idea is a dime a dozen. For every good idea that you have, there is 100 other screenwriters out there with the exact same idea. What you can do is execute that idea, because there's not going to be 100 screenwriters who executed that idea the way that you did. And like you're saying, that's the output. That is where the time needs to be put. You could develop 10 great ideas and then not write any scripts, and cool, good for you. Go try to sell 10 ideas versus having 10 scripts. That next one, your 11th script, is going to be that much better. But your 11th idea is just going to be kind of more of the same. Mm-hmm. Until those gears are turning, you're not going to see the results.
And I would say ideas are very wishy-washy. It's not really concrete until I often find this. I think I have a good idea and then I start writing it. And it's either not a great idea or it suddenly turns into a much better idea because I've had to dial up the clarity of the idea itself. If I can't write the pages and I can't create the logline and I can't pitch it to somebody, it's actually not a good idea. That doesn't mean it's never going to be a good idea. It's not a good idea yet. It's an idea that feels good in my head because I know what I mean, but that isn't going to convey very well to anybody else. I want to just make sure that I also kind of circle back to, you were saying, don't watch horror movies when you're writing a horror, or don't watch movies. You said one person doesn't even watch movies when they're writing a movie. This is where I think understanding film, understanding story, and I would say actually understanding genre really comes in handy, because I just write comedy, right? At the moment, I just write comedy. I'm not going to stop watching comedy when I'm writing, because then I would never get to watch comedy because I'm always writing. So my process is, let's just say I'm working on something. I see something on TV or in a movie, it makes me laugh out loud, and I'm so inspired by it, but I have to kind of go through this heuristic of, why did I just laugh at that? Is it specific to this project? Is there something I can take away from this? Should I allow this to influence what I'm doing? I'm going to pull a number out of nowhere, but I would say 75% of the time, I get to the conclusion that made me laugh because of the situation, because of the show, because of the actor, because of the writer. Not a lot of it translates to what I'm doing with my work. And if I allowed it to, I would be taking a step towards doing what they did. And I don't want to do that. I have to have faith that when somebody watches my work, or reads my work, they would have the same reaction that I just had to this thing that I saw that somebody else created. I don't let it influence me too much. Now, certain things do break that rule. So, for example, when I'm writing a comedy feature, something I have done quite often, and I think this is a good practice, I will read other comedy features and I will count how many times I laughed in the first 10 pages. How many either laugh out loud moments or bits that I remember I laughed at in the movie, because I want to write a strong opening. So I'm not taking on the style. I'm not copying the jokes. But if they're making me laugh 7 times in the first 10 minutes and mine is only 3, I need to dial things up a bit because it's a comedy and that's what it's supposed to do. So I think there's the kind of using the reference in a healthy way.
Yeah, like finding the rhythms of it.
Finding the rhythms. Yeah. Yeah. And that's why, going back to it, it's just understanding genre. It's understanding the craft of what you're doing. I think that can be extremely helpful when it comes to, should I be learning from this? Should I be allowing it to influence me? Or am I just staying with what I've got? I would honestly lean towards stay with what you've got. And because even if it's not working, eventually you'll find out. Trust me, you'll get feedback from somebody that says, it's not quite the right direction for you. So you will learn eventually. But if you just emulate everybody else, you just end up with this sort of mimetic, really going to stand out.
Yeah. And to your point of like finding the number of jokes and that kind of like, especially in comedy, joke density, I find a lot of scripts just are not taking advantage of every opportunity that they have for comedy. But then you also can go the other way. And if you swing at every single pitch, you know, you start to not care about the story, not care about the characters. It's just a vehicle for gags, which, you know, when you're looking at 90 minutes becomes a slog. Whereas like in 30 minutes, you kind of can do something that's just a vehicle for gags because it's going to be over soon. So finding that right joke density, knowing that everything is an opportunity for comedy, but not every single opportunity and every single script needs to have a joke. There is like a balancing act. There's a way, you know, there definitely, I think more often folks don't go far enough, but I have definitely also seen folks go too far. And that's as simple as just find out what jokes people laughed at the least and kind of cut them.
I agree, most people are not going far enough. I just released an episode with Chesida Giles where we talked about this, and it was, the question was, what would you say to writers who think they maybe are being a bit too controversial or a bit too edgy? And her response was, have you seen Human Centipede? You're probably not too edgy. Mm-hmm. Same with comedy. I think if you're, am I pushing too hard? Is there too many jokes? I heard Jay Leno, I think it was, say if you're a stand-up comedian, you should be making them laugh every 9 seconds. And it sounded so over the top. And then I watched a lot of good stand-ups, and he was almost to the second correct.
Wow. Okay.
There's a laugh out loud moment every 9 seconds if you watch a good stand-up. And I really carried that into my... Obviously, writing is a different thing, but I think a joke per page, even if it's just a small titter rather than a laugh out loud moment, you have to aim for that. There has to be
I'd even go as far as like 3 per page would be my benchmark.
Okay,
but that also is a broad spectrum of what constitutes a joke. Like a visual gag counts as a joke in that sense.
Yeah, if we're including visuals, physical, I guess I could see 3. Yeah. Frankie, where can people go if they want to find out more about you, if they want to watch Secret Menu Beauty Pageant or any of your work? What can we link people to in the description?
My comedy group is called Nice Hog Productions. We are at nice-hog.com. You can subscribe to our Substack at nicehog.substack.com. Every week we post film festival screening dates, live stream videos, new comics, movie recommendations. We kind of just set up a little bit of a weekly home just to put everything that we're doing as we continue to make new shorts and content. So you can find it all there.
We will link everything in the description. Anybody that's seen the previous episode thumbnail will be like, oh, nice hog. Oh, I get the image now. I'll try and find a more sensible image of you for this particular episode. Thank you so much for your time, Frankie. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you. And who knows, maybe there's a part 3 coming in the following months. Take care of yourself.
Take it easy, John.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Right in the Head podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. You know you want to. It's a great zero-cost way to support the mission we are on here at Right in the Head to share wellness information with the screenwriting community. If you want to go ahead and leave us a comment as well, it will please the YouTube algorithm. Therefore, this content will get shown to more screenwriters around the world. Finally, go ahead and click on the videos being suggested up here, maybe down here, depends on the end plate, and we will see you there. Wow, this is awkward.